morning, everybody, and welcome to this webinar for PlayMakers.live. I am Justin Flitter. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer for PlayBooks and the Community Ambassador for Playmakers. And I'm super excited today to have Casey Eden here. Hi, Casey, how are you?
Good, thank you. Thank you for having me. Looking forward to having a chat.
Absolutely. So, Casey, you're the co-founder of Orchestra, working with many companies to manage their share registries, company compliance, stakeholder management, employee share schemes, and secondary trading. But you have quite some pedigree. Before Orchestra, you co-founded neighbourly.co.nz, and you're also one of the team that co-founded grab1.co.nz as well. So I guess my first question for you is, why Orchestra, and why have you been motivated to set up a business to help companies kickstart their employee share schemes?
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And I'm certainly been part of a team on all those projects, as often happens. A lot of other people deserve a lot of credit on those. But look, ultimately, those businesses were classic startups with diversity of shareholding. So both capital raises with external parties, employee share schemes that involve the staff. And I suppose through all the diversity of those equity plays came this sort of challenge in our mind that we didn't think those shareholders were necessarily well looked after in terms of information, engagement, and the opportunities that creates for those particular parties. And so I suppose one of our goals in creating Orchestra was to build a platform where all stakeholders in a business could achieve that level of engagement, understanding, because ultimately we believe that's healthy for a business. So if you're going to go and get extra shareholders or give away employee share scheme equity, we want to make sure you get maximum bang for your buck. And ultimately, I think it's healthy for New Zealand to have a diverse investment, environment where people are confident to invest in private companies, and we think we can help with that process. So this was a problem for us that we've struggled with, and it's something we have both benefited from. We've always had ESOPs in our businesses, and they've definitely been some of the best things we've ever done. So we wanted to make that easier for other companies to have confidence to roll those out.
How do you think New Zealand compares to other countries, Australia, America, in terms of adoption of ESOP programs, or sharing equity in the company with their employees?
Probably the word I'd use is immature, like not necessarily against it. I think just a couple of years behind some of the rest of the world, and maybe in the case of the US, a decade behind. I mean, the US startup market, I mean, it's been, ESOPs are just something you do, right? It's almost, you wouldn't probably go and work for a startup without one. And I think that applies to even sort of stock standard businesses. People are used to share schemes, whether it be a big listed company or you name it. I think in New Zealand, we have a good community of ESOPs, particularly in the startup community. I think there's still some misunderstanding about the reason for them. And I think some New Zealand businesses maybe played a little bit safe and have this idea that giving away equity is a bad thing, and they kind of lose track of the win-win nature of why you're giving away the equity. You're not just giving away part of your business, you're actually trying to engineer a win-win scenario. So I think we're getting there. I think we're probably 3 or 4 years behind, maybe even somewhere like Australia, or we might be 10 years behind the US, but I think the interest in equity plays, not just in the startup world, is growing. So I think the questions about sort of how do you make that easier, and how do you sort of manage those processes that achieve what you need, that's probably the stuff that's going through people's head at the moment. But I think the interest we're seeing in just like, how do I set these things up and what are they trying to achieve, kind of signals to me that I think it's on the rise.
So that was one of my first questions for you today is, as a small growing business owner, why would I want to give away my equity in the business to my staff?
Well, look, it's an interesting question, and I could give you the PC answer, which is it's a good win-win scenario for everybody. But let's cut to the chase. It's actually really good for you as a business owner. You wouldn't do it if it wasn't good for you. So why it's good for you will vary from multiple businesses. It'll challenge probably your thinking as to why you're doing it. But I mean, it could be that you actually want to create a win-win environment for your staff where, if the business grows, you're both going to benefit from, even though you're giving away equity, your stake will be bigger again. And you're doing that because you're hoping that equity you're giving away is creating an ownership mentality with your key staff that will drive, harder work, potentially better decision-making, strategic thinking, et cetera, et cetera. All that stuff comes into, I guess, the overall sort of reasoning for an ESOP, which is about trying to align your key managers on the journey with you. And the flow-on effects of that could be that you're going to get staff that are going to take up some responsibility they may not otherwise take. That might give you a slightly better lifestyle. It might give you slightly better, I guess, engagement with your key staff, so that you might be able to actually not feel like you're on the journey by yourselves. You may be other reasons too. You may use an ESOP potentially for things like salary preservation, I call it, but I mean, essentially not having to pay someone so much if you can give them the ESOP, and that can help you from cash flow reasons. So you name it, it could be part of an exit strategy. So sometimes it's a continuity play. It's not always about the big exit play. So there's probably a dozen good reasons, but when you boil it down, you're doing it because it's good for you, but hopefully it's good for everyone involved with it too.
And I guess when you are successful and you are growing, you want to be able to share the rewards with the people that have helped get you there, right?
Oh, absolutely. Look, I can speak firsthand with the ESOPs I've been involved in, both as a party and sort of as a founder. And I guess I'll hark back to the Neighbourly one because that was the most recently one. But, we paid out significant money to probably 7 or 8 key staff members, really life-changing money. And that was the best day of the business for me, bar none. As a founder, you kind of rehearse what's going to happen if you have a decent exit, and it almost seems a little bit anticlimactic at the end. But the day we paid out the staff was probably the best professional day of my life, to be honest. I mean, putting significant chunks of money in their bank accounts that they earned, and they very much earned it. But to be part of that journey, I mean, those payments were awesome. Plus, just the way we got there, like when you're having those tough moments and you're sitting there in meetings and you're discussing what the hell you're doing, to have an aligned of 7 or 8 people, it's so powerful. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can't stress enough that if you set these things up right, and that is the key, like understanding why you're doing it, they're very powerful.
When you do offer staff skin in the game, have you seen that change their mindset in the way that they work?
Yep. I mean, look, it can vary for different people. And I go back to it. You do want to have conversations with your staff. It's super important you get to the bottom of what they want. Because I've also seen ESOPs set up badly where people assume that the staff member wants a big chunk of equity, when actually they might just prefer a $5,000 salary increase because they want cash right now to buy a house. So it is super important you do talk to your staff and understand what you're trying to achieve here. But if you set it up correctly and you have those chats, the things that you can see are going to be huge. It could be anywhere from, at the top level, it could be, a bit more work, but working a bit harder. Potentially they go, yeah, I'm an owner here. I'm going to put a few extra hours in. Probably the biggest thing I would say is the alignment on thinking on the long-term strategy. So often when you have staff, quite rightly, they're thinking about annual bonuses or getting to next Friday. When you're an owner, you're thinking about kind of a 3 or 5 year vision, and that aligned thinking, just what it does when you come together and you discuss strategy and you discuss where you're heading. I think it allows you to be a such more powerful machine with lots more, tentacles poking out with different staff who are doing different things, who are aware of where you're heading. So it comes with some honesty, because you need to actually explain to these people, probably a bit more of the business than you otherwise would. You might talk about cash burns and money and raising all those bits and pieces. But if you do all that and you're open, I think the power is huge if you come out the other side with more people that understand, I guess, that direction of the company.
So you spoke about how different staff want to be rewarded in different ways, which is great. How do you decide who to offer ESOP program to? Is it everyone? Is it just your key, your C-suite? How is that decision kind of formulated?
Well, it's a good question, and I want to stress there is no right and wrong on this, and different companies have different views as to way to do it. I mean, traditionally, ESOPs have probably been a more comfortable tool in the sort of C-suite type level, because I suppose there's this assumption that level of staff member understands the risks that come with ESOPs, because there are risks for staff. I mean, you may be foregoing salary, you may be playing a game over a period of time. And as we know with startups, to be brutally honest, the majority don't hit their targets. So it could be that you have a heap of equity that means nothing. So I guess the assumption has always been that C-suite kind of level people will understand the pros and cons of the opportunity. But in truth, I think in a particularly a startup business that might be, 7, 8, 10 staff, I think they can work for everybody. And I think whether you're the newest person in the team or the most lowly paid person, I think having that opportunity to have a small equity play, it may be that you're not able to sacrifice as much salary or much upside, because you sort of need the cash. But I personally don't think there has to be a limit on who gets it. Now, in saying that, as I sort of mentioned before, there is this opportunity or this discussion required to make sure that someone actually benefits from it in terms of what they're going to achieve. If they sort of are given equity, but it doesn't mean anything to them, they don't necessarily work harder, or they're not like to stay, you may be better to give them a little bit more money or do nothing. So you still want to make sure they actually value it. And if they don't value it, then arguably they shouldn't have it. But personally, I've seen amazing ESOP schemes set up with the most junior people in office who have seen this as their break, their chance to make some real money. And I know firsthand with the likes of Enabler, if you can make 50 or 100 grand in lump sum cash, I mean, that's life-changing money. And as one of my favorite sayings in the startup game is it's hard to save riches. I mean, these lump sum wins, even for someone young, it's huge if you set it up right. So I don't think it has to be only C-suite staff, but of course you do need to cater the benefits to the right level. So someone at the C-suite level might need quite a chunky ESOP to be motivated. Someone at the lesser level might need something a lot more minor.
When you're offering staff an ESOP program, are there options to purchase shares in the business as well as part of that?
Well, that's sort of different. I mean, this is when you get into, to be honest, it's kind of a different problem set. I mean, offering staff the ability to purchase shares in a business, it's always possible, right? The interesting thing is the FMA has an act and it does have some rules around capital raising. And so most founders will kind of stumble into this at some point, is that doing capital raising comes with a few rules and it's around primarily the investor's knowledge of the situation. So I won't get into it because it's a whole nother topic, but the difference between wholesale and retail investors and staff fall into different groups. And not all staff are freely able to purchase capital in a business. Senior managers potentially are, or those that have a high salary band are, but selling equity in your business to a staff member isn't quite as easy as you might think. It can be done, but just understand it's not quite as easy. Whereas an ESOP is a lot easier because the assumption with an ESOP is less risk for the staff member, it's more upside. The FMA do, and for good reason, has rules to stop people just selling equity in a business without some blockers because, probably the risk is that people who don't have the knowledge purchase in. So yes, you can, but that's probably a different conversation around a capital raise versus an ESOP scenario.
So how have you seen best practice, or what have you seen best practice wise in terms of engaging staff on company performance who are part of an ESOP program, and what should you be sharing and how often? And
look, different startup founders or different founders in general, business owners are going to have different perspective on this. And regardless whether you're an ESOP or not, I think some of the same rules apply. So I personally think transparency in a business is a good thing, and I'm always going to err on the side of transparency, and that's regardless whether someone's an ESOP or not. I'm going to tell them as much as possible the nitty-gritty of what's going on in my brain. I'm going to tell them as much as possible about the roadblocks and the opportunities and everything that goes with it, because personally I believe that they'll be a more powerful member of the team the more they know. It doesn't mean that you necessarily will find out everything, and so an interesting topic around ESOP will be, do you tell people what everyone else is getting in terms of ESOP? Because they will vary. Some people will have a big salary cut to get more ESOP, and if you don't know the context of all those discussions, it can be quite dangerous to share. So most of the time people wouldn't share necessarily what everyone else is getting, but they will traditionally get the information that a standard investor would get, which is not necessarily like that granular. It could be a quarterly update. It could be a little bit of information about strategy, capital raising, etc. So probably, if anything, I'd think about it as standard investor information, which is probably not telling a staff member, to be honest, much they wouldn't know already. And as I hinted at probably before, not telling them anything that I wouldn't suggest telling them anyway, because you want them to be engaged. But what hopefully it does allow you to do, as I mentioned earlier, is have that conversation around the long-term vision and thinking about that 3 to 5 year window and how that will change their behavior, as opposed to just aiming for how to get to next Friday.
Are you advising companies on, or advising their employees on, kind of tax obligations and what the impact is for them on that side of the equation as well?
Good question. I mean, look, our Orchestra ESOP play is pretty new. It's only been around a couple of months, and at this stage, primarily it's a management tool for the company, and the staff can benefit from visibility through that. Our advice kind of component of it, we have to be very careful at the moment. We're not financial advisors. We're very comfortable kind of giving people generic information around how ESOPs work, and we're very comfortable talking to any founder about, because there is 3 or 4 types in New Zealand, and they do vary, and they have different tax implications, etc. And we're very comfortable talking to both staff and employees right now about that. But we always put a precursor on it, which is we're not advising you. We're just telling you kind of generically how these work, and we suggest you go and get advice from your sort of tax experts on this. Because there is, I think, still, as I mentioned, with the immaturity of the New Zealand ESOP scheme, there is, I still believe, some unknowns that play out in the tax world, particularly with the different types of ESOPs, and I think they'll take a few years to settle down. So very important that you as a staff member go and seek your own advice, but we're happy to, I guess, at a top level explain kind of the principles and send you off on your way to have the individual advice that you want to take. And one thing we're hoping to build, obviously, with Orchestra is a slightly more end-to-end process which can more formally give out advice. But one of our learnings at the moment is trying to figure out, I suppose, how vanilla are these processes? Like, can we build a system which kind of deals with 80 or 90% of the people in the same way? And that's sort of what our product's trying to discover. But very happy. I mean, particularly founders, we're probably having 2 or 3 conversations a day at the moment with businesses who just want to understand ESOPs at a top level, the implications and kind of where to go next. And we're very comfortable having those conversations.
So what are the kind of top, or the key 3 or 4 different types of ESOP programs? How are they different structures?
Yeah, so I mean, this, to be honest, we could probably have a 2-hour seminar on this question. But the majority of startup companies in New Zealand will use what's basically called call options. So this is where it gets a bit confusing with the terminology. Some people will call ESOP employee share option plans, and some will call it employee share ownership plans. So let's just say call options is kind of the core one. It's probably 80% of businesses, I'd say, in New Zealand. The basic concept of an option is it's relatively risk-free for a staff. They're given a contract to purchase shares at a later stage of the business for a predetermined rate. You as a company carve out a number of options, and it kind of, in the future that your equity can be diluted if people buy at a future state. And the basic premise, I guess, for staff is they don't have to outlay money at the start. They will eventually have to outlay some money, but it might be quite minimal at that point. Like, it might be 1 cent a share, it might be $1 a share. They will have a tax obligation at that future stage, but generally they're only going to pay and buy those shares if the company value has gone up. So as I mentioned, unfortunately, in the startup game, as we know, not all startups make it. So, this way you don't have to actually shell out money for the shares early. You kind of own the rights to them. And then in the future, if you think the company's doing the right thing or it's sold, you do almost like a wash up of those shares on the final day, and kind of you have some tax bill to pay, but you'll make money. So that's the option scheme. The other, probably the sort of second largest one in New Zealand, is what I'd typically call like a loan to purchase scheme. Typically used by founders or often early stage companies. Slightly sort of interesting scheme, and I definitely will get your own tax advice on this one. But in short, effectively what happens is the company will loan staff money to buy shares on day one, and typically they'll loan the staff at a 0% interest rate. So it's kind of a book value transaction to buy shares on day one. Typically you'll own the shares. They might be held in a share trust beneficially for you, but over the next few years, depending on who you talk to, they might be capital gains free if you set up the scheme right. So from that day onwards, whatever you've paid on day one, it's capital gains free. But just to be clear, you'll also have a loan to the company to buy those shares. And so hypothetically, if the company goes south, you could have someone, knock on your door asking you to pay for shares that hold no value. So that's the upside and the downside risk of that scheme. Very popular with early stage founders and often sort of C-suite level people. And then the other couple of schemes, a phantom share scheme, usually used by professional services companies, lawyers, accountants, etc. That's more of a dividend sort of repayment type plan. So it doesn't formally issue shares. It's just kind of a internal knowledge that, hey, in theory, we're saying you own 2 shares when it comes to dividend payments. And then sort of the fourth sort of hybrid scheme, I'd call it a management buyout, which is arguably not really an employee share scheme, but it's a method for continuity kind of transactions. So you might have a couple of key staff who you want to bring in, and hopefully over time they sort of purchase the rest of the scheme. You can use the same principles of an ESOP to sort of create that management buyout opportunity. But traditionally for sort of startup and growth companies, it'll be options or a loan to purchase scheme.
One question we've got from one of our viewers is, are they expensive to put in place?
It's a good question. I mean, not if you are relatively, and I use the word vanilla, kind of creating a system which hopefully doesn't go too far off the beaten track in terms of your options. I mean, different lawyers in New Zealand will offer different packages, but we're aware, and we work with a couple of lawyers that can put a basic option scheme in play for anywhere from sort of $3,000 to $4,000. That'll get you a deed. So that's the sort of the core rules of the ESOP. And then you'll have like a templated grant letter, which allows you to then issue grants out to your staff. That's your sort of your setup costs. And then in terms of managing it, I mean, traditionally people have just managed it in a spreadsheet. One of the problems of that has been kind of getting engagement with staff. That's where Orchestra hopefully kicks in and helps with your management. That could be anywhere from sort of $20 to $50 a month to help manage it. But it gets, once again, if we do that right, the engagement you're going to get from staff who understand the scheme will pay back in dividends and future, etc., because people will actually understand how that works. So, I mean, look, I suppose what is an engaged staff member worth? I mean, an engaged staff member could be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars to a business a year. So when you think about that, you know, if it is an ESOP scheme costing you, I don't know, even if it costs you $5,000 to set up or 10 grand and you spend $1,000 on it a year to maintain it, I mean, I think it's nothing compared to the upside benefit.
Absolutely. So before we kind of get into how to get started with this, are there any other kind of compliance issues or other things that you advise companies to get done before they start setting up an ESOP program?
Well, traditionally, most companies, so the process generally starts with a shareholder agreement. So in your core shareholder agreement, you'll generally have some terms dealing with ESOP potential. And if you don't, you'll have to go and talk to your shareholders about it. And the reason I say that is that generally there's a dilutionary effect on existing shareholders. So when you set up an ESOP, regardless of the method, you are in effect diluting those existing shareholders of their equity. So traditionally they will need to agree to that. And that's often done at the time of a capital raise. It's very upfront. And I should also stress the majority of funding bodies in New Zealand, or even externally like VCs around the world and stuff, they're demanding these schemes now. They're not saying don't do it. They're actually often pushing companies to give more. They're asking them to put, 15% or more. I've seen some recently at 20% of the company into these schemes because they understand the benefit that they get if those schemes are set up correctly. So generally it starts with the shareholder agreement, ensuring that that's been documented and it generally is understood. Then after that, it's probably having those discussions with your staff, potentially someone like Orchestra. We're happy to sort of give our advice for free at the moment, just about different schemes, and subsequently potentially your lawyers and accountants who we work with as partners to design your scheme up. You have to think about a few bits and pieces along the way. I mean, a lot of the major compliance tasks actually happen right at the end of an ESOP when it comes to exercise the shares. So I won't bore you with details, but when you have to exercise, there's a few implications with the IRD around disclosures and stuff like that. But in the early stage, there's not a whole lot of work, but mostly it's around, I think, not so much compliance. It's about having those deep, meaningful conversations with your team about exactly what you're trying to achieve, because that's actually probably more important than necessarily to the legal structure. And one of my sort of personal pain points I see with this industry is a lot of people have gone to lawyers and accountants who have set them up really lovely ESOPs, like technically speaking, they're correct, but they haven't hit the mark in terms of what they're trying to achieve. And I think that's really the core issue between talking to your staff and talking to people in the know, other founders, like really drill down into what you're trying to achieve with the ESOP, and then you'll come out with a better scheme.
How do we get started with Orchestra? Would you like to take us through some of the platform?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, I won't bore people with it, but long story short, I've just flicked into Orchestra here. Orchestra is we mentioned before, it's a compliance, it's part compliance, it's part share registry, it's a part ESOP. We've only been going about 8 months ourselves, so 300 odd customers using it. We're sort of figuring out these bits and pieces. I won't go through the main part of the site with any depth, but what we have ultimately is a share register product that documents all the moving parts of the equity in a company with diverse shareholdings. If you kind of have more than 5 shareholders, you're right up our alley. We document all the key shareholder information. We connect up with the company's office. We provide that full share register service that you legally need to have. We can document, so we call them associates, people with the convertible notes or safe notes. We have features for that. We deal with all the transaction history in a company, so all the things that you need to document over a 10-year period. We also have secondary trading platforms and the like. So that's all kind of part of the core platform. We have document vault functionality, communications tools with your shareholders. All that's available as a standard part of the Orchestra system. But in regards, I suppose, ESOP and core, because ESOP doesn't always have to be options either, but we have this concept of, with Orchestra now, an ESOP platform was sort of within the core platform, which allows you to build out your ESOP scheme for all to see. So at a top level, what we have inside of our Orchestra tool, and it's only a couple of months old, and we've got lots of things that are coming in the next couple of months to bulk this out, but the basic concept is that you use Orchestra to document your ESOP pools and then give out grants to your staff and then set up all the vesting schedules and exercising schedules to happen off that. So I mentioned all the different types of ESOPs. You can set up multiple different types within Orchestra, but the core version is actually called as options. So inside an option pool, most companies will carve out a number of options, which then you can basically, over the period of time, allocate those out to people in terms of grants and then do all the necessary steps that follow, so vesting and exercising, etc. So Orchestra acts as a platform to see all those changes taking place. For each individual staff member, we can create those vesting schedules, including all the information, the documents that are attached to it, etc. But basically build a vesting schedule out, which could be a combination of automatic vesting, manual vesting, KPI vesting, etc. But we build out all the schedules. Then as an administrator, all that stuff that you'd normally have to do yourself is happening in the background. When it comes time to do things like exercising, we have the ability to exercise right through to your cap table, right through to the New Zealand Companies Office if required. So all that management is taken care of for you as an administrator. And we're just at the moment building out some graphical functions that will allow you to sort of track visually over time how these vesting processes work, and also in time things like e-signing of your grant documents, all that kind of stuff. But the main thing is, even as an employee or someone who holds ESOP, and doesn't necessarily have to be employees, it could be contractors or board members, you get this kind of visibility at an employee level. So you don't see everyone else's, but you can log in on your side of the platform and see all your different agreements. You can, for example, when shares are vested or options are vested, you get notifications of that. As I mentioned, with things like graphs, you'll get to see all those things set up over time. And then for those that are interested on the company admin side of it, we also have tools that flow back through to the main share registry, for example, that allows you to do things like track the dilutions of those shares. So if you do have people with options, you can jump in there and then you can see, okay, if these people all get their options, what actually happens to the main cap table. You can see the dilutionary effect of those. So yeah, we're sort of confident there's lots of moving parts in this. Things in the future we want to add, valuation tools, like I said, basic taxation sort of management without actually giving advice, but tools to allow people to track all that stuff. Any kind of the document e-signing for grants, that kind of stuff. But even at a basic level now, for the majority of people who we've loaded up ESOPs for, and we've probably got 100 or so in the system of the 300 customers that we have in total, they've never had visibility. They've only ever had a spreadsheet that, if they are lucky, the CFO may take them through once in a while. At least now they've got this ability to kind of track through all these options and grants and see the stages and the history, and download certificates that show them what they have for their accountants and all sorts of bits and pieces like that. So yeah, I think even at this base level, it's providing visibility they've never had, with lots of moving parts still to be built into the platform.
Excellent. Well, and just a few months since you've launched, the platform is really taking shape, and obviously got some great functionality in there to help people build out their ESOP program. In PlayBooks, in the public library here, Orchestra has published a number of playbooks that you can use in your meetings with any of your clients, and obviously is a great resource there for you to start having the conversation with people. And of course, you're more than welcome to connect with Casey and the Orchestra team if you'd like to learn a little bit more. Casey, there's been some really key benefits for me today, engaging your staff in the long-term vision, sharing in the rewards of your business if and when you are successful, which seems to me to be absolutely logical when you're building a new business and looking to grow, and certainly to retain and reward your staff along the way is a really powerful reason to be using an ESOP program. Any final words for us?
Oh, no, thank you for the opportunity. I mean, I think that summary was spot on. I mean, look, I would just say to everyone, don't fear giving away equity. I think it's one of probably the conservative New Zealand business's probably biggest mistake is thinking you're giving away your company. Just remember, with all these schemes, they really only cost you equity if the business has grown, and they really only cost you if you're winning too. So yes, you may have given away 5%, but the 95% you own, or the whatever you own, will be plenty. So don't think about it as giving away equity. Think about it as creating a win-win scenario. And I promise that there's been very few ESOPs I've ever seen that have resulted in a bad outcome for the founder. Because I mean, without going into details, things like options, you really only realize them if the business has gone well. So understand that they're designed very much to help create win-win scenarios with you and your team.
Awesome. And thank you all for joining us today with myself, Justin Flitter, and co-founder of Orchestra, Casey Eden, for this Playmakers webinar. Really appreciate your time. We'll see you at the next episode.